My name is Jack, and I'm a gravedigger at Green Hill Cemetery in rural Texas. I started this job 5 years ago. The pay is good, and the place is quiet, perfect for someone like me who prefers solitude. I've always found comfort in the silence among the tombstones and the gentle sound of the wind passing through the old trees. One day I arrived at the cemetery around 6 in the evening, as usual. The sky was starting to darken, and I knew I had a long night ahead. The job of a gravedigger isn't easy, but I've gotten used to the routine. Digging graves, keeping the grounds clean, ensuring the headstones are in order. I've always liked working at night. It's calmer, without visitors or interruptions. That night, I went straight to the oldest part of the cemetery. It was an area I always avoided, perhaps because of the stories the old gravediggers told about the place. They said it was cursed, that those who worked there ended up going mad, but I never paid attention to those superstitions. I started digging a new grave. The sound of the shovel hitting the soil was rhythmic and comforting. Suddenly, I felt a strange chill down my spine. I stopped for a moment, looked around, but saw nothing. The wind was stronger than usual, and it seemed to carry whispers. I ignored it, believing it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I continued digging, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I looked around again, trying to identify anything unusual. Everything seemed normal, but that strange feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to focus on my work and ignore the unease. I finished digging the grave and sat on a nearby bench to rest. The cemetery was completely dark, except for the dim lights of the old lamps scattered around the grounds. That's when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A quick black shadow passing between the tombstones. I quickly turned my head, but there was nothing. My heart raced and I felt a wave of panic. It must be my imagination, I murmured to myself, trying to calm down. I got up and started walking toward the office, but the feeling of being followed was undeniable. I looked back several times, but all I saw was darkness. When I finally entered the office, I locked the door behind me and sat at the desk. My heart was still racing and my hands were shaking. I grabbed a glass of water and tried to calm down. That night was the first time I truly felt scared in the cemetery. I spent the rest of the night inside the office trying to work, but my mind was stuck on the shadow I saw. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and needed a rest, but deep down I knew there was something more, something I still couldn't understand. When the sun started to rise, I left the cemetery with a sense of relief, but I knew I would have to come back the next night, and the idea of facing that place again made me uneasy. After that unsettling night, I returned to Green Hill Cemetery with a nervous feeling I couldn't shake. It was as if something was waiting for me there. I arrived around 6 in the evening as usual and prepared for another long night of work. The wind was particularly strong that day, making the trees sway and emit almost human-like sounds. Fallen leaves swirled around the old tombstones, and the atmosphere seemed heavier than ever. I began my routine by checking the headstones, making sure everything was in order. As I walked through the cemetery, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if every shadow between the tombstones was alive, following me with invisible eyes. Suddenly, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A quick black shadow, fleeting and swift. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine. I forced myself to keep working, trying to ignore the growing fear. Later that night, I went to the newer part of the cemetery to dig a new grave. It was dark, and the only light came from the old lamps scattered around the grounds. As I dug, I started hearing whispers again. "Jack? Jack." It was as if the wind was calling my name. I looked around, but there was no one. The cemetery was deserted. By this point, I was starting to get really scared. I kept digging, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could swear I heard someone laughing softly, a faint, malicious sound. My entire body was on high alert, and every muscle was tense. That's when I saw something that made me freeze in fear. Between the tombstones, a dark, indistinct figure moved slowly. It seemed to float, and I couldn't make out any details of its face or body. It was just a shadow, but a shadow that exuded a malevolent presence. The figure stopped and seemed to stare at me. I felt as if my heart would stop. The shadow then dissolved into the air, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I dropped the shovel, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I tried to pull myself together, but my mind was racing. What had I seen? Was my imagination playing tricks on me? Or was there really something there? I picked up the shovel from the ground and decided to finish the job as quickly as possible. Every minute in that place felt like an eternity. After finishing, I went straight to the office and locked myself inside. I sat at the desk, trying to process what had happened. The visions, the whispers, the dark figure. None of it made sense. I grabbed a glass of water, my hands still shaking, and drank slowly, trying to calm my nerves. I spent the rest of the night inside the office, too scared to go back into the cemetery. I heard the wind outside, the whispers that seemed to call me, but I forced myself to ignore them. When the sun started to rise, I felt a profound sense of relief. I left the cemetery with a troubled mind, knowing that something very wrong was happening. I needed to find out what it was. But fear and doubt were beginning to take hold of me. Every shadow seemed more threatening, every whisper more sinister, and I knew that somehow my life would never be the same again. After the disturbing visions of the previous night, I returned to Green Hill Cemetery with a heavy heart. The feeling of being watched and the whispers lingered in my mind. I arrived at the cemetery early in the evening, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The night started off quietly. I did my routine of checking the headstones, sweeping the dry leaves off the ground, and preparing to dig another grave. The sky was dark, moonless, and the stars seemed more distant than ever. As I worked, the wind blew gently, but it carried an unsettling murmur. While digging the new grave, I heard that whispered voice again. "Jack." I immediately stopped and looked around. There was no one. The cemetery was deserted, as always. I felt a chill down my spine, and my heart began to beat faster. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave, but my voice came out shaky and weak. Silence was the only response. I continued digging, but the whispers became more frequent and louder. "Jack, Jack, get out of here." The words were clear but came from all directions. It was as if the cemetery itself was speaking to me. My hands trembled, and sweat dripped down my face despite the cold night. I decided to investigate. I set the shovel aside and began walking through the cemetery, following the whispers. They led me to the oldest part, where I had seen the shadow the night before. The fear intensified, but I needed to find out what was happening. As I walked among the old tombstones, I saw the black shadows moving quickly again. They seemed to surround me, dancing around. My breathing was heavy and rapid, and my heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I saw something that made me stop abruptly. In the dim light of one of the lamps, a figure appeared. It was a woman, dressed in a dirty, tattered white dress. Her hair was disheveled, partially covering her face. Her eyes were empty, like two black holes absorbing all the light around them. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. She just watched me, motionless. Suddenly the woman opened her mouth and whispered, "You need to leave, Jack. They won't leave you alone." Her voice was cold and desperate, filled with pain. Before I could react, the figure vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. I stood frozen, paralyzed with fear and disbelief. My mind was in turmoil. Who was that woman, and who were they? I ran back to the office, locking the door behind me. My hands were sweaty and trembling, and my breathing was fast and irregular. I sat at the desk, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The voices continued to echo in my head, telling me to leave. I spent the rest of the night locked in the office, too scared to go outside. I heard the whispers outside, calling my name, mocking me. When the sun finally began to rise, I felt a profound sense of relief. I left the cemetery as quickly as I could, but the voices continued to torment me even during the day. I asked my colleagues if they had heard anything, but they all denied it. They said I was tired and needed a break, but I knew there was something more. Something dark and malevolent was trapped in that cemetery, and somehow it had chosen me as its target. Each passing night, the whispers grew louder and the visions became clearer. I needed to uncover the truth, but fear and doubt were consuming me, and I knew that somehow my life would never be the same again. The days turned into a haze of anxiety and fear. Each night at Green Hill Cemetery seemed to worsen my situation. The voices, the shadows, the figure of the woman, everything became more intense and frightening. I knew I needed to uncover the truth behind these apparitions, but I didn't know where to start. One night, before heading to the cemetery, I decided to do something different. I took out my phone and started researching the cemetery's history. I found some basic information, but nothing that explained what I was experiencing. Then I stumbled upon an old newspaper article. The article, dated over 50 years ago, talked about a series of mysterious disappearances in the town. The victims were all people who worked at the cemetery. According to the report, the authorities never discovered what happened to them. The only clue was the testimony of one of the old gravediggers who, before disappearing, reported seeing shadowy figures and hearing voices. This account sent a chill down my spine. The experiences of that gravedigger were eerily similar to mine. I decided I needed to talk to someone who knew the cemetery's history more deeply. I remembered old Tom, one of the oldest gravediggers in town, now retired. He always had strange stories to tell and might be able to help me. I went to Tom's house in the late afternoon. He greeted me with a smile, but I could see the concern in his eyes when I started recounting my experiences. When I finished, he sighed deeply and invited me inside. "Jack, there's something you need to know about Green Hill Cemetery," he said, his voice grave and serious. "That place has a dark history, much darker than most people know." Tom began to tell the story. Many years ago, before he even started working there was a woman named Abigail. She was one of the first grave diggers at the cemetery and had a reputation for being kind and dedicated. However, rumors began to circulate that Abigail was involved in black magic practices. They said she performed strange rituals in the cemetery, trying to communicate with the dead. One night, Abigail mysteriously disappeared. A few days later, her body was found in one of the newly dug graves. Apparently, she had been brutally killed. From that moment on, reports of apparitions and voices in the cemetery began. They say Abigail's spirit never left the cemetery, Tom continued, and she is accompanied by other restless souls, the same ones you're seeing and hearing. Tom's story left me even more scared, but also determined to understand what was happening. I decided I needed to go back to the cemetery that night, but this time, with a plan. I brought a powerful flashlight, a voice recorder, and a small cross my mother had given me years ago. I arrived at the cemetery and began walking through the older areas, where the apparitions were most frequent. As I moved forward, I felt the air grow heavier, and the whispers began again. I turned on the recorder, hoping to capture some evidence of the voices. Suddenly, the flashlight started flickering and went out completely. I stood still in the dark, listening to the whispers around me. "Jack, Jack, you shouldn't be here." The voices seemed more desperate, more intense. Then I saw Abigail's figure again. She was standing, watching me with those empty eyes. I raised the cross, hoping it would drive her away, but she didn't move. Instead, she started whispering something I could barely understand. I stepped closer, trying to catch her words. Help us find peace." The words were filled with pain and desperation. Before I could respond, she disappeared again, leaving me alone in the darkness. I returned to the office, more disturbed than ever. I played back the recorder, and there were the voices, clear as crystal. Help us find peace." I knew I had to do something to help those lost souls, but I didn't know where to start. I decided I needed to investigate Abigail's story and the other disappearances more deeply. Maybe if I discovered the truth behind their deaths, I could finally set them free. The journey was just beginning, and I knew it would be full of dangers and challenges. But I was determined to face whatever it took to bring peace to those restless souls, and perhaps find my own peace in the process. My mind was in turmoil after the conversation with Tom and the discovery about Abigail. I knew I needed to delve deeper and understand more about what had happened to her and the other disappearances. There was something profoundly wrong with the cemetery, and the clues I had indicated that Abigail was involved in dark magic practices. The next morning, I went to the town library to search for more information about Abigail and any possible connection to rituals or occult practices. I spent hours flipping through old books and historical records. Finally, I found a reference to an ancient ritual called the Night of Spirits, known for being performed to communicate with the beyond. The ritual involved summoning spirits through a magical circle and using specific items, such as candles, herbs, and an altar. The description seemed to match the image I had of Abigail performing rituals in the cemetery. In the late afternoon, I decided I needed to go back to the cemetery, but this time with a purpose. If Abigail was trying to communicate with the dead, perhaps I could discover something that would help me understand what was happening and how to help these souls. I arrived at the cemetery just before dusk and began preparing the site. I chose a spot in an old, secluded area where the apparitions were most frequent. I set up a small table and placed candles, incense, and some of the items I had found in the ritual description. As I prepared the altar, the wind began to blow more intensely, and the shadows on the gravestones seemed to move. I felt a presence, as if I were being watched. My heart raced, but I continued with the ritual. I lit the candles and the incense, creating an atmosphere that resembled the description I had read. In the center of the table, I placed an old photograph of Abigail that I had found at the library. I was ready to start the ritual, but a sense of insecurity paralyzed me. I decided to begin summoning the spirits, following the steps outlined in the books. I drew a magical circle with chalk around the altar and began reciting the words meant to call the souls. The atmosphere in the cemetery grew heavier, and the wind seemed to intensify. Suddenly, I felt a chill run down my spine. The candles began to flicker, and the smoke from the incense formed strange patterns. I heard a low whisper, as if a voice were speaking directly into my ear. "Jack, Jack." My breathing became heavy, and I looked around, trying to see where the sounds were coming from. The shadows on the gravestones started to form indistinct figures, and the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. In the midst of this chaos, Abigail's figure appeared before me again. She was clearer than before, and her empty eyes seemed more penetrating. She extended her hand towards me and whispered, "You are close to discovering the truth. Continue and find what was lost." I felt a wave of hope mixed with fear. Abigail's figure seemed to be trying to guide me to something. I knew I was on the right track, but I needed more information to fully understand what was happening. I decided that the next step would be to investigate more about the location where Abigail had been found. I needed to discover if there were any additional clues that could explain what she was trying to tell me. After concluding the ritual and extinguishing the candles, I left the cemetery with a renewed sense of determination. I was ready to face whatever was necessary to uncover the truth behind the apparitions and bring peace to the restless souls. The mystery was unfolding, and I knew that each step brought me closer to the truth. But I also knew that the path ahead was filled with dangers and challenges that I would have to face alone. The discovery of the symbol inside the empty coffin was the missing piece needed to understand the mystery of Green Hill Cemetery. I felt I was getting closer to the truth, but I also knew I was dealing with powerful and dangerous forces. Night was approaching, and I knew I had to confront what was hidden deep within the cemetery. I returned to the office to prepare for the next step. Based on the evidence I had gathered, I realized that the symbol found in the coffin was linked to a spirit summoning ritual, likely performed by Abigail to control or communicate with restless souls. The area where I had found the symbol seemed to be the epicenter of all the supernatural activity. I decided that the best course of action was to face the problem head-on and attempt a banishment ritual to pacify the spirits and end the dark magic practices. For this, I needed specific items and careful planning. I gathered white candles, salt, holy water, and an old book I found in the library about purification rituals. As night fell, I prepared the site in the cemetery where the symbol had been discovered. I chose a spot in an old secluded area, surrounded by ancient trees and weathered gravestones. I set up a small table and arranged the candles in a circle around the empty coffin, sprinkled salt around for protection, and placed the holy water in a container at the center. The old book was open to the page with instructions for performing a banishment ritual. As I prepared the space, the wind began to howl, and the shadows on the gravestones grew more pronounced. I felt a strong presence, as if the restless souls were gathering to witness what I was about to do. With my heart pounding, I began the ritual. I recited the words from the book, invoking divine protection and asking for the restless souls to find peace. The atmosphere around me grew even heavier, and the shadows seemed to move in unsettling ways. I heard the whispers again, louder and more desperate. Suddenly, Abigail's figure appeared before me, clearer than ever. Her empty eyes were fixed on me, and her expression showed a mix of pain and hope. I knew this was my chance to finally help her and the other trapped spirits. "Abigail," I said, my voice trembling, "I'm here to help. Please, show me what I need to do." Abigail extended her hand toward the symbol drawn on the inside of the empty coffin. "The ritual needs to be completed. The circle must be closed and the spirits set free. Only then will we find peace." I followed her instructions, completing the magical circle with salt and reciting the final words of the ritual. As I spoke, the candles around me began to shine with an intense light, and a wave of energy seemed to envelop the cemetery. The shadows on the gravestones writhed and then dissipated, and the whispers faded into a profound silence. I felt a sense of relief and calm, as if a massive weight had been lifted from the cemetery. Abigail's figure smiled gently and began to fade. "Thank you," she whispered. "Finally, we are free." As Abigail disappeared completely, the last of the shadows dissolved, and the atmosphere in the cemetery became clear and peaceful. The oppressive presence was gone, replaced by a serene calm. The ritual had worked. With dawn approaching, I finished tidying up the site and extinguished the candles and ritual items. I looked around, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. The cemetery was calm and quiet, and I knew that the restless souls had finally found peace. Back at the office, I shared my findings and the resolution with Tom. He listened attentively, visibly relieved. "You did a great job, Jack," he said. "I always knew something was wrong, but I never knew how to help. Now, perhaps the cemetery can rest in peace." With the cemetery free of the malevolent forces that had haunted it, I knew I was ready to move on. The mystery had been solved, and the torment of the restless souls had ended. I felt an inner peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. My journey at Green Hill Cemetery had come to an end, but the experience had taught me much about courage and determination. I was ready to face new challenges and continue my life with the assurance that, even in the face of the greatest adversities, truth and justice will always prevail.